Is the Yamaha YZF R125 really as good as its reputation would suggest? Well, I've owned one for 7.5 years, so of course I am going to say yes. But let's talk about it. So, if you're here watching this video, you either follow me, or you follow the channel, or you may follow this bike, or you're simply here to get an owner's opinion on this bike. Now, I've owned this bike for 7.5 years, and my opinion as to whether this bike really is as good as its reputation would suggest is going to be based largely on my 7.5 year ownership, as well as some partial comparisons that I can make to half a dozen other 125s that I've ridden. So what have I ridden? Well, I've ridden the Lexmoto LXS. Very nice bike, very nimble, you can chuck it about the place, definitely a good one. I've also ridden the LXR SE, and that's very similar to the LXS. It's like a just like a bigger version of the LXS, really. I've also ridden my friend's Cafe Racer, which is always a pleasure. I've ridden a Freedom, that's the Lexmoto Vixen. That bike doesn't do more than 50 miles an hour, but it is so much fun. Ironically, that bike, the owner of that bike, his son has borrowed it, and when I last spoke to his son said that he was just using the bike temporarily whilst saving up for a YZF 125, which I love. It's perfect for this video. And I've probably ridden, yes, I've ridden two other 125s way back in my CBT days, and I will say that, yeah, that's a half dozen 125s I've ridden other than this bike, and none of them actually are as good as this bike. I will say that the LXS and the LXR SE are very good starter bikes, and whether you'd be better off on one of these or one of those may in fact come down to personal preference, or maybe what you could afford. It may also come down to whether you're willing to buy a second-hand bike or whether you're looking for something brand new. So what makes these YZF 125s so good then? Well, the most obvious advantage that this bike has, in my opinion, is its looks. It just looks amazing. Now, admittedly, these have changed over the years. This is the Gen 1 that run from 2008 to 2014. Then you've got the Gen 2 that looks very similar, and that ran from 2014 to 2018. Now, it is trying to rain, so I am heading over to an OG spot where I can park up and take some footage of the look of this bike without having to worry about the rain. So let's circle back to the looks of this bike. The next advantage I would say this bike has over others, and it's something that people often overlook, is the weight of this bike, or more specifically, the lack of weight. I can compare this to the LXS and the LXR SE, and I can say that those bikes are significantly heavier. So if you are worried about dropping your bike, you might want to consider something nice and light like this. And then there's the one that people would have probably gone to first, which is the power of this bike. When you talk about power in relation to 125s, some people say there's only so far that conversation can go, but you're always going to be limited on how much power you've got. This has 15 horsepower, and it does slightly beat some of the other bikes I've ridden. The LXS has 13.2, the LXR SE has 14.7, I believe. But to be fair to the LXR SE, when I rode that bike it was brand new, and so I couldn't make full use of its rev range because it wouldn't have been fair on the engine. I expect that bike is similar in power to this bike, but from my experience this bike does slightly beat them. And then there's the refinement. There's something about how smooth everything is with this bike. Maybe it's just this one, I hope not. I'd like to think quite highly of Yamaha. I've ridden one other YZF R125, which was a Gen 2, and that was just as smooth as this. It felt slightly different, of course, because it was a slightly newer bike, but it definitely had the same refinement as this. Everything feels smooth. The brakes are amazing, front and back. The gear change, you do have to keep your gear pedal very well greased, because otherwise, yeah, your gear change isn't the smoothest. And that is something that they fixed on the Gen 2. Your gear lever here is connected to the gearbox via this connecting rod here, which is something they changed on the Gen 2. On the Gen 2, the lever isn't connected up here. It actually goes from here straight into the gearbox, but they had to reverse the gearbox in order to do it. This is why you can't fit a Gen 2 gearbox to a Gen 1, because if you do, your gears will be upside down. In fact, if you fit a Gen 2 gearbox to anything other than a Gen 2, the gears will be upside down, because by Gen 3, Yamaha went back to this arrangement with the connecting rod. So you may have to keep your gear lever nicely greased to keep that refinement that I've been talking about. Now that we've parked up, we can circle back to the looks of this bike. 17 years ago these came out, and I think they've aged very, very well. This particular model is 14 years old, but for a bike that was designed and released 17 years ago, I think it looks bloody brilliant. This particular model of mine, because we've been riding in the rain quite a lot, yeah, it needs a really good clean. But despite the fact that it needs a really good clean, it still looks bloody brilliant. I definitely think that the look of these bikes is definitely one of the big advantages of having a YZF R125. Well, that and the power. Yamaha claimed that the YZF R125 would do 84 miles per hour. Now, I can neither confirm nor deny such claims. Doing 84 miles per hour on a 125, that would be outlandish and fantastic. I also find the bike quite comfortable. Yes, it's a sports bike, so you've got the hunched over riding position, which doesn't really cause me any problems on a day-to-day basis. Yes, if you ride a sports bike for an hour, you might get a bit of a bad back, but that's almost to be expected. And then you've got the seat. It's soft enough. I've certainly had worse. This seat has never caused me any problems in the 7.5 years I've had it. So for a sports bike, definitely nice and comfortable, I'd say. But then I am 6'2", and so when I'm on this bike, I'm not as hunched over as some people would be. So is there anything about this bike that I think you wouldn't like? Things that you wouldn't get on with? Well, let's start with the riding position. Now, I'm 6'2", and so when I'm on this bike, I'm still sitting quite upright. Naturally, the shorter you are, the more hunched over you're going to be, and the more you're going to feel that sports bike effect. Likewise, if you are short, you may struggle with the seat height, because this bike does have quite a tall seat. Now, you can lower these bikes. You can get your shock links changed and get some that lower the bike. Can't really see mine buried in there. Something that I discovered recently is that this bike has been lowered. I never knew. if you're thinking of getting one of these bikes, if you get the opportunity to, just have a sit on one and see how it feels. I'm not saying you'll necessarily get the opportunity to ride one, but if you can at least sit on the bike, you'll know whether it fits you at least. And lastly, insurance. Something that people forget about, something that people don't particularly want to talk about, is insurance. But if you're thinking of getting a YZF 125 and you're, let's say, 17, you are going to be stung on your insurance. You'd be much better off getting yourself a cheap 125, riding that for 12 months, getting yourself a year's no claims, and then going and getting a YZF 125. That said, if you can fit on one of these and you can afford the insurance, you definitely won't go wrong with a YZF 125. Then again, there's a couple of other bikes that you probably wouldn't go wrong with, because let's face it, all bikes have their contenders. And so a couple of bikes that I will mention. First honourable mention goes to Yamaha's MT 125, which is basically the naked version of this bike. So if you're looking for something that's potentially even more comfortable than this, with all the refinement of this bike, consider the MT. And then there's Honda's CBR 125. I recall last year a ride, a somewhat enthusiastic ride, shall we say, over to the milk shed, and with me was my friend on his 125, on his MT 125, and another biker that we know who at the time had a CBR 125. And let me tell you, all three of us were very evenly matched on our bikes. But I think that when you're looking for a bike, I've heard many stories from people who say that they considered this bike and that bike and another bike, and they had a list, they had a pool of bikes that they could possibly have bought, and in the end they decided what bike they wanted. And for me, it was very obvious what bike I wanted in the end. When I was first looking for bikes, I very quickly built up a pool of bikes that I was considering, but admittedly that pool of bikes very quickly shrunk to 3 bikes. It was between this, the KTM Duke 125, I never did get to ride one of those, and the KTM RC 125. I never did get to ride one of those either. Although earlier this year I did get to have a really good look at an RC, and it's a very nice bike. I could probably have been happy with it, but in the end it was always going to be a YZF 125 for me. And so I'll say that if you are looking for a bike, at the point that you categorically decide what bike you want, I would say stick to your guns and get the bike that you want. I'm quite particular, and I wanted a specific bike, you know, specific make, model, colour, right down to the colours of various things like the wheels. Yamaha, they, even when the make and model doesn't change year to year, they like to change the colours and the decals. And back when this bike was released, they would change, for example, this middle panel here. It used to be black, and then they changed it to blue. They like to release the exact same bike the following year, and all they do is change the wheels from silver to black. In the end, I decided that I wanted a YZF 125 Gen 1 in this colour blue. I wanted the middle panels blue because it made no sense for them to be black, and I wanted this decal set with a black tail and black wheels. I was very specific, particular, picky even, but I stuck to my guns, and I would suggest that you do the same. I really did set my sights on this bike, and I've never looked back.